Thank you all so much. Appreciate it. So in continuing the theme of honoring Dean, the next session will be our budget session, which Dean was always led and did an incredible job leading that session. This was his session. So my colleague Stephanie and I are going to do our best to fill his shoes and in his spirit lead a robust conversation about the state budget and how it impacts local values or state values. And we have some great panelists who will join for this conversation. So I'm going to introduce my colleague, Stephanie Goldman, to get us started. She is the Associate Director for FACCC. Stephanie.
Good afternoon, Stephanie Goldman. Like Evan said, I'm the Associate Director for FACCC. I do most of our lobbying. I also spent many, many hours on the golf course with Dean, and I miss him every time I go out there. So on to the budget, which was near and dear to his heart. Every year, the governor and the legislature negotiate a new state budget and determine how much funding our institutions will receive. Budgets are a reflection of our values, so it's imperative that we engage with the governor and the legislature and help them better understand our priorities. Today, we'll take a deep dive into the relationship between the state and district budgets with our panel. Andrew, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, I'd love to. Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew Nickens. I'm the Vice President of Legislative Affairs for the Student Senate for California Community Colleges. We're the official voice of 2.1 million students. My job is mostly managing our advocacy and policy work. I'm a student at Folsom Lake College and part of the Los Rios Community College District. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Ron, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Stephanie. Good afternoon, friends, colleagues. My name is Ron Gerhard. I am the Chancellor for the Chabot-Las Positas Community College District.
Thank you. And last but not least, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. I am Sarah Thompson, and I currently serve on the board for FACCC. I am also Las Positas College's Academic Senate President, where I've been sociology faculty there for 25 years.
Great. Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it, Ron, Sarah, and Andrew for taking the time to be with us. So Ron and Sarah, I know you have some information you'll be sharing with us, but I want to get us started with one quick question to get the conversation going, if you don't mind. So a little context here first. You know, as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about the state budget, how it impacts local budgets as well. And obviously the student-centered funding formula is a big part of that, on how funding occurs. So I have one question to get us started here. And the question, I want you to sort of take this in any direction you'd like to. But let's talk about per pupil funding. And the question is, does the student-centered funding formula increase or decrease per pupil funding? And why is per pupil funding so important from your perspective? Yet how come it often gets overlooked in state priorities? So with that, I think I'll kind of go through and call on each of you. Maybe Andrew, if you could start first.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. Of course, you know, this question is something that for the students is really important. It's how our institutions in large part get funded, and it's something that it's absolutely critical that the state gets right. And so I will say that in particular to the per pupil funding, it is so important that it's a metric that the state uses to really provide funding to students, because it's so core to ensuring that our institutions really get the funding they need in regards to the rest of the funding formula. So, you know, it's something, you know, from at least from the Student Senate perspective, is something that really is a huge point of focus for us. So I just want to say that, you know, it's something that we feel is overlooked by the state, and I'm really happy that this is one of the first questions that we have to really highlight this issue, and that we're addressing it today. And I'd love to hear, you know, some other fellow panelists here and what thoughts they have on it, because it is indeed, you know, so important.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, and I appreciate the students' leadership on this point. It's been mentioned a couple times in the conference, about how the other systems of public higher education are funded at a such higher per pupil rate, right? So that's something we need to work on together. Sarah, I'll hand it over to you. Tell us a little bit about your perspective on this question.
So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to contextualize the per pupil, per FTE divide, and try to see the original question was like, you know, budgets are our values. So how does the FTE, you know, per FTE allocation reveal a value, right, within the system? And then I'll let Chancellor Gerhard go ahead and look at it through the lens of the SCFF, right? So I will go ahead and share my screen. So as has already been mentioned, when we look at the community college allocations from the state, our per FTE is less than any of the other systems. The K through 12, the CDE said that for 2021, they were expecting to spend $16,881 per pupil, so per head count. The community colleges per FTE, and I'll talk for a moment about why FTE is problematic. From the Legislative Analyst's Office, their final version spending plan estimated that we would be spending $8,700 per FTE in the community colleges. Although when we look at the general fund allocation, that's closer to $7,300, and that's extrapolated from the most recent submissions to the state in terms of student enrollment. And Ron will get more into that in just a moment. Now, the CSUs and UCs, regardless of their state allocation, do have the ability within certain parameters to augment the state support through tuition. And so historically, they have had higher per FTE expenditures in the community colleges. The CSUs are closer to the K-12 numbers, whereas the UCs are a couple thousand above that. So let's look for a moment at the problem with FTE as a funding base. If our budget is our value system, then what we are seeing here by funding community colleges per FTE, it assumes a very middle class college experience of 4 15-unit semesters prior to a degree or to transfer, right? So currently we are funded FTE 525 contact hours, or 15 units, right? Under our previous funding formula, we were getting 5621, all right, per FTE. Under the SCFF, it's 4009. However, this definition of what a full-time student is not in lockstep with, for example, how financial aid identifies full-time students, which for its purposes can be a student of 12 units. For students with qualifying disabilities, full-time for financial aid can be 9 units. So our definition of full-time is based on an assumption that students can participate full-time, have the class privilege to be able to do that. So this one FTE, right, this 115 unit could be a variety of different makeups. It could be one student taking 15 units. It could be 3 students, 2 students taking 6 units, 1 taking 3 units. It could be one full-time DSPS student at 9 units and another student taking 6 units, et cetera, right? Which is why the head counts for districts is always so much higher, all right, than the full-time equivalent. So this funding by FTE also makes the assumption, all right, that the fewer units you take, the less expensive you are. However, looking at all of the expectations we have of community college districts to supply counseling, student ed plans, encouraging all students to fill out FAFSA forms, etc. At the community college, there really is no economy of scale, which means more students doesn't mean it's less expensive, because so many of our services are so individualized that regardless if you're taking 9 units or 15 units, seeing a counselor for an hour is seeing a counselor for an hour, right? Having a person in the financial aid office process your paperwork is processing your paperwork. When faculty grade papers, they are grading your paper. They're not grading groups of papers, or hopefully they're not doing that. All right. So funding us by FTE, by this definition, underfunds us from the get-go. So we're starting off with being underfunded, and the new SCFF model just exacerbates that. And I'll turn it over to Ron to take it from there.
Thanks, Sarah. And thanks, Evan, for the question. So I think, Sarah, there you go. So, coming to the question at perhaps a higher level, probably like many of you, I've been in the system, California community colleges for a bit, through at least 3 funding models going back to program-based funding. And those that may recall that is, one of the challenges of many that we advocated at the time to get SB 361 in place is the fact that there was different fundings across the state and between districts that largely created an inequity. And we went to SB 361 as a system, and I think there was largely wide support for that because it's somewhat equalized, right? We used PFE to help, bring districts up to the 90th percent level, and no one lost funding. But in answering the question, it created a common funding rate for districts received per FTES. So does the SCFF increase or decrease funding at a per pupil funding? The answer is yes and no. As a system, it does, because part of the carrot or the stick in it is that the system received about $125+ million in additional funding to transition to the student-centered funding formula. But when you look at at a district level, when you look at the per pupil funding, the answer is no in many instances. As you see it on average under the student-centered funding formula, on average the per FTES funding is about $7,400 per FTES. Now again, as a system we're getting more money, but there are many districts that the answer to that, their specific lens would be no. They're not getting more funding. And there's a huge range, as you see in this table, in that while the average is about $7,400, you have districts that are on hold harmless that are getting about $7,000 or $6,900 per FTS, and they're on hold harmless, right? Which essentially what that means is that they're being funded at a higher level, because if they were being funded by the student-centered funding formula, they would be receiving much less per pupil. So, that's kind of the part of the conundrum that folks may be hearing, colleagues may be hearing around the state related to the student-centered funding model, is that there are many districts, mostly depending upon what region and community that they're serving, that are disadvantaged in this funding model, and not because of fluctuations in enrollment, which is what I hear mostly attributed to. It's mostly attributed to really the location in which they reside and the community in which they're serving and the student demographics that are in that community. So I'll stop there because that's a pretty meaty question, but Evan, I appreciate that.
Can I add just a little bit to that to explain the graph a little bit more if it's not self-evident? That currently under the SCFF model, and this was actually data again extrapolated from the first reports of enrollment for this year, right? That we have districts who are getting $5,872 per FTE. And we have districts getting as high as $14,479. All right, so there is a great disparity across the state in terms of districts and what they are receiving per FTE.
Great. Thank you so much. That's really interesting. We're going to keep the conversation sort of focused on this idea of the student-centered funding formula. And really, when this went through that budget process, gosh, what was that, 2018, the arguments and the idea behind the student-centered funding formula was to increase equity. So what are the metrics and how are they actually being applied? Is one form of success being valued over another? And again, Andrew, I think we'll start with you.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'll combine some other kind of holdover comments to the first question as well as to this one, but I just want to say that it's how is one form of success being, being valued over another? I think that what the other panelists have demonstrated is that although the funding formula certainly seems to incentivize or at least predicts that students are going to be attending full time, and that's what success looks like, for many students, even attending part-time is a huge success. I think last fall, around approximately 70% of our students were not full-time. And the idea that, also the idea that this system is among the most diverse in terms of not only age, ethnicity, and an income level, and 40% of our students are older than 26. And so for some, even just attending part-time is a huge success, and it takes a lot of resources to get there. For the average low-income student, they have to work around 30 hours a week to attend community college full-time, and simply is not a reality that fits with this formula that's being sold to us. It simply doesn't fit. And so it does not value even the success of students who are working very hard to even just attend college. And that's what really I think that we should be highlighting, is that community colleges are an access point to higher education. It's a ladder of social and economic mobility, a route to economic self-sufficiency. And when we value and don't recognize the realities of other students who are worse off over those who are much better off, I think we're failing our students, we're failing our system, we're failing the state. And so I'd say that's one way in which, certainly there's a type of success that's not being valued, not being represented.
Thank you, Andrew. It was so refreshing to hear you really touched on some of the struggles our part-time students have, and how this funding formula fails to recognize that. Sarah, would you like to touch on this question?
Sure. Actually, I think I'll let Chancellor Gerhard take the next slide, which is going to look at the efforts of the SCIF to address giving funding to our most vulnerable economically disadvantaged students. And then I'll take a look at the other piece of the equity issue, which is, are we reaching students traditionally excluded from higher education?
Okay, thanks, Sarah. And I'd just like to, echo Stephanie's comments and thank you, Andrew, for your comments. I mean, I know that resonates with all of us and what we're seeing in terms of students as they're coming to us, especially in these most challenging of times that we're all experiencing, and that the broader conversation going on in terms of recognizing student basic needs, and how could we better support and fill those needs as really they create barriers to entry and access to our classrooms. One of the things that at least I've been looking at, and colleagues of mine have been looking at, is that does the student-centered funding formula increase equity? And folks may recall that was a big talking point back in 2017-18 when the student-centered funding formula was kind of unveiled, if you will, in a hurried fashion and channeled through the processor. And you know, in my mind, from my perspective in the landscape, you know, the equity is directly attributed to the supplemental allocation, which is about now the 20% that's based upon the number of Promise Grant recipients and Pell Grant recipients. And then there's some sprinkling of that, if you will, in the success allocations in terms of, you know, what I call these bumps, that if you're a student who has received a certificate or an AA or an ADT and you're a financial aid recipient, you know, then there's additional incentives or bumps in funding to the colleges. But, you know, from my perspective in terms of the funding formula is that there are some things to the remaining that could be improved upon. I think from a kind of a 30,000 foot level, you know, we all would agree to the talking points of the notion that our system needs additional resources to support students that have been marginalized, historically disadvantaged, and those students that come from maybe even a socially economic background where they need to work 2 or 3 jobs and couch surf or do whatever to not only sustain themselves and live, but also buy books and continue their educational pathway. And I think the thing or the aspect of that we all subscribe to that. The challenge, as we've looked at it, and I think you may be seeing it on your screen, is what this deep dive and evaluation has illuminated is the fact that you know, our statewide financial aid structure and system is flawed. And when we look at, again, the SCFF student-centered funding formula is largely based upon Pell Grant and Promise Grant recipients. When we look at the percentage of students actually receiving those forms of financial aid in regions throughout the state of California, there is inherently an inequity in the data that we see. In that, you know, depending upon where, again, the community that the college is serving, if it's in a higher cost of living area, the data clearly shows that in those higher cost of living areas, there's a greater chance that those students are least likely eligible for student financial aid, not because the students earn too much, but when you factor in cost of living and you factor in other economics as necessary to enroll and continue to pursue education, those students often aren't eligible for a Promise Grant or a Pell Grant. And so going back to the question, the objective of the funding formula is to increase equity. Yeah, we all subscribe and agree to that. But one of the things that we're identifying is that the equity isn't necessarily, the SCFF, the inequity is built within the financial aid structures that exist. And this has been an ongoing conversation both with the Student Aid Commission and the State Chancellor's Office and the legislature. And because the SCFF is tied to those forms of financial aid, in many respects, it has not increased equity across the state to our students. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Ron. Sarah, did you have anything else to add on that?
Yeah, well, I'll just sort of pick up from there. So the reason we included this data is because the Public Policy Institute of California has created the most sophisticated measurement of California poverty. They include not only income, but cost of living, housing and food prices, access to social safety nets like WIC and subsidized childcare. So it really is our best measurement that we have. And the one thing that, as Chancellor Gerhard said, you can see from this form is that poverty across the state is relatively constant, right? There are some regions that have slightly more poverty than others, but this is a California problem, right? This is not a regional problem. But currently our California Promise Grant allocations aren't reflecting that reality. So the other motivation behind the student-centered funding formula, besides helping students who are economically disadvantaged, was also to attempt to address our equity issues, right? Specifically, looking after students who have been historically excluded from higher education, with particular focus now on like African American and Latinx students. And so looking at the SCIF formula, the question becomes, does the SCIF formula address that? And so what we've done here is we've just done a little micro study that should be done at a much broader spectrum, but looking at the demographics, comparing the demographics to the districts with low FTE allocations based on the SCIF, right? And those with the highest. So we've taken the extremes, the 3 lowest FTE allocations, the 3 highest. And we wanted to look at the demographic breakdown, right? And so here we have a chart looking at the total headcount of the districts with the lowest, right? So we see the demographics that the ones with the lowest have 4% African-American students, combined 44% Latinx students, 31% white students. Now, if we go to the 3 districts with the highest, right, allocation per FTE allocation, the interesting thing is that we see almost a duplication of that data, right? 8% African-American students, 48% Latinx, 33% white non-Hispanic. And then I'll just do the side by side because it's a little bit easier, right, to see that way. Now, this has to be explored in much greater detail than we have started out, because there are some issues which would affect per FTE expenditure, such as the size of your district, right? If your district is, very low in head count, right, you will most likely have higher overhead in terms of, paying your president and, having all of, having your library, et cetera. So the next step is actually to remove all of the base allocation that sort of covers that, and then look at the impact of the SCIF per district, all right, that would sort of control for the big district versus small district. But what we can see initially, at least, is that the demographics of students are relatively the same, except that in in the high FTE allocation areas, you're getting a lot more per FTE. All right, you're getting almost 3 times as much per FTE, all right, than you are in the lower FTE allocation districts. And I wanted to pick up on something that Andrew had said, which was looking at these metrics, right, of success, because this is another element of it, right? What are we valuing? What are we rewarding, right, in terms of success? And if we pull from the SCIF formula itself, and we look at the point system for what has been identified as student achievement, of course, it is very value-laden, in which transfer is obviously valued more than CTE, despite what students' goals are. Despite what students, want to achieve in college, we are sort of imposing, again, this very middle class and, dare I say, elitist notion about what we think students should be getting from community colleges by putting price tags, right, on the different forms of success.
Thank you, Sarah. So we have talked a little bit here about the state policy, the implications, and thank you all for the great data here and really demonstrating that here for our session. I would like to transition a bit now into the local implications of this. And the first question I have to make that transition is a question I'll ask to Andrew first. I think hearing the student perspective on this is really important. So, Andrew, do you believe there's a disconnect between what the state thinks its budgeting is accomplishing and what's actually happening on the ground, right? So you're a student leader who happens to also be an expert in the state budget. You're talking with legislators often, and you're also obviously speaking with students often. Is there a disconnect between the two? You'll have legislators say, oh, we gave X amount of money to this, that fixed the problem, right? Could you elaborate on that a little bit, Andrew?
Yeah, definitely, and I think there's a huge disconnect. Some of my there's the discussion we've had here about SCIF today, I think certainly is an example, but to extend it further to other areas, I would start with the COVID-19 response block grant that was approved by the legislature last year. It was a $120 million block grant that allowed districts to make use of it for a variety of different purposes. One of them being, basic needs in addition to, PPE and also for faculty, I think, and in terms of professional development. And I will say that, it was meant to provide resources to districts to help combat some of these things. And, from a student perspective, it was very difficult to see the impact of what we thought the state was doing with some of this funding and what the actual student impact on the ground was. And I will say it's a constant I think fight with the legislature to really demonstrate the community college experience, not only for students but just as institutions, as a system, what our experience is. I've met with legislators. I've heard them speak even within the last few weeks in hearings that their idea of a community college is still very traditional. It's Democrat, Republican, whatever it may be. There's a perception that community colleges are more affordable, that our students are coming out of high school, that there's no recognition that we are the most diverse system in higher education. We're serve a lot of more older students, returning students with parents, and the fact that for low-income students, it costs more to go to a community college than a UC or CSU. That's one of the most mind-blowing facts that I first learned when I got into student governance. It's something that I think is a message that continues to be not fully understood, and I think it's obvious from some of the actions that the state takes in regards to the actions they take and at the state level in terms of how that translates to the local level, that message really isn't fully understood. I think we all have a lot more work to do, as not only statewide advocates, but also, local advocates to really ensure that we're connecting the dots between state funding and local funding, and really all joining together as advocates to make sure that we can draw a straight line. And I know that leads to some of the next question, but I just wanted to, hopefully that provides a little bit of a segue as well after my other panelists have a chance to speak.
Appreciate that, Andrew. Thanks so much. So yeah, Ron, do you have any thoughts on this in terms of is there a disconnect between the state budget and what's happening locally?
Yeah, again, I just, going behind Andrew is pretty difficult. And on top of that, I think Sarah just called me overhead, and I'm still trying to struggle to digest that and come to grips with it. But I guess, I have 4 children and 2 of them are teenagers, so I guess I've been called worse. So I'm over it. So, I think yes, echoing everything Andrew said, and that, looking at some of the data that, Sarah has kind of presented, and the short answer is yes. Again, from the highest policy perspective, and what our funding formula that we have now is intended to do is, again, it's from the talking points is we would all agree and subscribe to the fact that we need as a system more resources to support vulnerable student populations and underrepresented and underprepared student populations. But looking at some of the data that Sarah walked through is that there in many communities and many regions across the state that simply isn't happening. I know there's been a lot of conversation about fully funding the student-centered funding formula and what would that do or what would that mean. In some groups, it's the dollar sign behind that is that the state and the governor and legislature would need to augment our system-wide funding to the tune of about $140 million. And I think we would all make passionate, persuasive, compelling arguments why that is not only in the best interest of the state, but also obviously our students and our communities. But again, in context of the environment that we're in, is that we all know and advocate for us, because we know we're the greatest economic engine of the state in terms of rebounding of the state economy and getting back into the workforce and everything that follows from that. But unfortunately, at a system level, we're about 140 million short, and looking at a more detailed level at a college level, there are about 40 districts and more colleges, especially being many of those multi-college districts, that without one-time money and hold harmless money, we would be in a position where we would have to be forced into conversations about reducing access to students. And that just seems so contrary to really what we all know, that we're best equipped and positioned to really support our state and support our economy to rebound from this terrible environment.
Thanks, Ron. And Sarah, I'll ask you the next question, but in the meantime, could you stop sharing your screen, and then we can end up shifting over to a little.
I still have more table.
Oh, I apologize. Okay, well, never mind. Keep on sharing then. Sarah, take it from here.
All right, thank you. All right, so yes, there are, I think, some gaps between what the intention and what I think the Chancellor's office is hopefully thinking that the SCIF model is doing, and what the actual outcomes are. When we look at some of the ways in which the SCIF has already had to be modified over, just the past year and a half, in terms of, for example, capping the success points, right, where you can be successful but not too successful, because we can't afford you to be too successful. So, and that sort of takes away from the spirit of this, which is supposed to be, right, to help students get to where, it's again the gateway, right, to hopefully a better life for themselves. The one sort of a measuring point for how well the SCIF as a model is doing has recently come out from the Chancellor's office in the form of the SCIF dashboard, right? And the SCIF dashboard is basically a presentation of mostly financial data in terms of how well the districts are doing now since we've moved to a new model. Unfortunately, right now, the SCIF dashboard focuses, or tries to focus, almost exclusively on gains rather than the challenges, right? Rather than the deficiencies, right, of the model currently. So it's not really recognizing a lot of the flaws that we have been identifying up to this point. And in fact, there have been some confusing presentations of data, right, on the dashboard. And just a couple that we've identified. One initially, in the first dashboard, there was a strange graph that suggested that FTESs actually went up significantly after the implementation of the SCIF, which turned out again not to be the case. There was not actually significant growth. But the the Chancellor's office reviewed that and actually replaced it with a much more accurate graph. So I think, yeah, we're all kind of learning, right, what these measurements mean. But there's also some challenges when they present their comparison between pre-SCIF model and the SCIF model. For example, it doesn't include what Chancellor Gerhard had mentioned earlier, was that there was a $125 million infusion or incentive, right, given by the state, right, to go to the SCIF. So if you put that 125 million in the previous model, it would probably look like it was distributing a few more dollars as well. We've gotten a COLA, or a cost of living increase, since the last model, and that's been sort of just folded into the presentation of the success of the SCIF, which is not appropriate either. So I think the dashboard itself has some issues. We definitely need to see it expanded, so it covers not just the good, right, but the bad and the ugly as well, so that we have a much better idea of what it is about the SCIF that needs to be fixed. And this deserves our attention because actually most of the students in the California community colleges are in districts that are struggling with the SCIF. There are 72 districts. There are 8 basic aid districts. So there are 64 districts reliant on the state exclusively or almost exclusively for funding. 36 districts are either on hold harmless or some kind of stability funding. In other words, not SCIF funding. So that's 56% of that 64. And those 36 districts serve between 60 and 66% of all California community college students. The disparity in the numbers is whether or not you include basic aid districts in your calculation. So there is a gap of what the SCIF is intending to do, right, and perhaps what the Chancellor's office thinks it's doing, and what the actual reality on the ground is.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. So this has been really, really interesting. But I think to sort of bring it back to, everybody who's participating in this conference, what can, our participants, our faculty, our students do more to learn about their district's budgets? How can these inequities be addressed? Andrew, we'll start with you.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I think, for me, really being involved in participatory governance at a college level, but also at a district level, and one of the largest districts in the state, I had a huge opportunity to participate in discussions around a variety of different issues that could impact students. But one of the things that was always more arcane, a little difficult to get information about, to really dive into, was conversations in my district's budget. And so, I want to almost start with not something that students or faculty could do, but one thing that I think districts could do, and that's be more, transparent with students and faculty. Show them and be more transparent with that information about the budget, how it gets decided, what decisions the state are making that impact them, so that students and faculty can be aware of these things and present the information not merely as just sharing it, but also highlighting, what can we as a district, what can we as students and faculty do to improve the outlook for our district, for our students, and use information to advocate to the legislature for change. Because me personally, as a student, I mentioned that example just briefly there, that block grant that was handed down, to districts. It's hard for faculty, and I know even the student trustee who was my close colleague of mine, to even understand some of the decisions that are being made. And if there's more information sharing at a local level, I strongly believe, and if we're all kind of join together and more as partners, I strongly believe that that we can do more to use that information and advocate to the legislature for changes. I know, some districts have, some lobby days, other things like that, and I think those are really, really critical to demonstrate to the legislature this is the need, but also just to educate them. One thing I believe is currently being discussed in the budget is, as a condition of receiving some funding, districts have to develop a plan to demonstrate how these funds will be used to serve students equitably. A plan. And I'm sure many of you know, districts already do develop student equity plans. This is exactly what they already do. So there's confusion that we have to dispel. There's information that we have to share and bring back to our local representatives that will not only hopefully educate, what is the status quo, but then what do our districts, what do our students, what do our faculty need to become whole. And as Ronald mentioned, there's a huge economic argument here as well. Our system drives the state's economic recovery, and our enrollment is normally up during periods of recession, but it's down 10%. So it really demonstrates that unless community colleges are taken care of, the state's recession will be harmfully prolonged, and we will be locking students out of the access point of higher education, and that just has detrimental impacts. So that speaks to the imperative of why we need to get involved in this work at a local level. So I just wanted to share that.
Thanks, Andrew. That was really helpful. It put a lot of great context into what we're talking about today. Sarah, Ron, do you want to go next?
I'll go next, because I know Sarah probably has another slide. It just probably at a more higher level, in the most simple terms, engage. I know of the 134 participants on here, there's probably many that that they would probably prefer not to go to a planning and budget committee. Or a budget committee. There's probably those fair share, and for those I would say get your notes of those friends and colleagues that do either chair a budget committee or are in tune with that. It just in the most simple terms, engage and ask probative questions. How are we doing in the student-centered funding formula? I think perhaps would be the starter, and just don't be afraid to ask those questions. I know a lot of it is dependent upon the culture of the institution that if you're a faculty member that you work in terms of the transparency of those numbers and what is the underlying assumptions of that. Just engage and ask those questions, and from a student perspective, do the same. If you're a student, I would, as a formerly recovering chief business officer, I always made it a point to go and visit with this academic senate, student senate, classified senate, to have those conversations, so that there is to the greatest extent that I could create that environment, that there was a common understanding of the condition that we, operative word, we are in, because it's everyone's budget, it's everyone's value statement, and everyone should have an opportunity to understand and give their feedback. And I'll leave it there. I know Sarah has a slide.
Okay, well, I have slides that people can look at things, but I completely agree with Andrew and Ron that that engagement is critical, and it's really active engagement rather than passive engagement. Just to give you an example, in our district, we at our college, we meet between 2 and 4 hours every month for our budget meeting. We do between between 4 and 6 hours a district, all right, to talk about budget, and then we have like subcommittee work and things like that. So it really is being actively involved in your district's budget takes a considerable amount of time. But what I wanted to do for those who were interested in your district's budgets, but needed some springboard questions to ask. If you're not familiar with or you don't know the answers to these, you should, because a lot of these questions reveal the vulnerability your district may be facing right now in this transition to a SCIF model. And the first question is, how much is the district poised to lose when transitioning to the SCIF model, right? What categories are responsible for that loss? And what is your district actually spending right now to address those losses? Because you may find that your district is actually spending money in terms of administration or in terms of classified, in other words, not in the classroom, but just to address, all right, the supplemental or the success allocations. Has the district started discussions on reductions? And if your answer is no, you probably don't know, they probably have. And what criteria are being evaluated? And this is where that 10+1, right, that your senates need to be all up in it. And the 9+1, because students have a planning and budget, right, guideline from Title V as well. And union involvement, the unions definitely should be fully engaged in these discussions and be able to contribute to those discussions of criteria. If you are in a district where you've actually seen your per FTE allocation go up, how have those monies been distributed? Is it in the spirit of the SCIF, or is it covering like other operational costs that, you know, your district just couldn't afford to fund under the previous model? And so tracking like how those extra dollars are spent are important. In order to see how vulnerable your district is, what percentage of your budget is in salary and benefits? Most districts, it's incredibly high. I know that our district goal has always been to be between 83 and 87% of our overall operational budget being with salary and benefits. But right now, I'll tell you, we're closer to 95, right, as a district. What that means is that any kind of loss in general fund, right, even a 1% or 2% loss would definitely end up in job losses as well. So it's important to know how much of your budget is tied up into salary and benefits. And how is your district using categorical funding? Oftentimes categorical funding becomes, you know, a godsend to districts, right, as additional monies, but sometimes districts use categorical funds to fund essential personnel. In other words, personnel you cannot function without. And so those would be personnel that you would have to absorb in your general fund should something happen to the categoricals. And anyone who's been in this system long enough knows that categoricals are always very, they are funded intermittently, right? Inconsistently. So being engaged is important, but also knowing what questions to ask to sort of suss out or gauge the vulnerability of your district is also really important.
Thank you, Sarah. So I do have a question or two. With time permitting, I'd like to get to in the chat. But Sarah, I do want to make sure you have an opportunity. Does that conclude all the slides you were going to show? Thank you so much. I didn't mean to cut you off earlier, so sorry about that. Andrew, I have a question for you here. You had mentioned earlier that it can cost more actually to go to a community college than a UC. Could you kind of explain why that is?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's a combination of a few things. Number one is that community colleges differ fundamentally from UCs and CSUs in the sense that there's no institutional aid really available to students. And despite community colleges boasting, some of the lowest tuition costs, and those tuition and fees even being waived through the California College Promise Grant or the California College Promise, or additional assistance with the Pell Grant, there doesn't exist any other really vehicles or financial aid programs that help pay non-tuition costs, things that aren't related to tuition, books, supplies, housing, transportation, food, childcare, all the things that tend to add up. And the Pell Grant certainly helps cover some of that. And a Cal Grant, if you're lucky enough to get it as a community college student, But that's what really contributes, is if you're a low-income student, it's often better to go to a UC or CSU because you get more aid in terms of institutional aid and a Cal grant. So that's what really contributes to that, and that's what I think makes our system more expensive for a low-income student.
Thank you for explaining that. And that's an important point to make, Andrew, and I want to commend you and the SSCCC for your leadership on that point, and connecting the basic need funding, right, and keeping that funding ongoing. You've done an incredible job this election cycle advocating on behalf of that, so thank you. I have another question in the chat here that I'm going to direct towards Ron and Sarah. So the question is about our previous funding model, which was touched upon earlier, SB 361. And the point was made during the last recession. There were some challenges with that funding model as well, in terms of we were funded based off enrollment, and then during a recession, enrollment jumps through the roof, at least it did, and we didn't have enough funding to reach that based off just the way that funding structure worked at the time. Obviously, the funding formula doesn't fix this problem either, the student-centered funding formula. So are there any ideas of funding formula that would work better, not just for that piece, but just in general? If you had the ability to snap your fingers and make the perfect funding formula, what were some ideas you would have in it?
I don't see Sarah unmuting, so I'll take a first stab at that one. You know, that's such a difficult question, because, you know, in any budget, whether it's a personal budget, a college budget, a state budget, you know, funding is finite. You know, I think as long as, you know, for example, thinking of the Great Recession, right, and thinking to beginning in 2007 and 8 when we had the downturn, and, you know, we were decimated. Like Sarah said, many categorical programs, at least 2 that I can think of, were completely eliminated, and many of those programs were cut by 46, 48%. Our unrestricted, we had to basically do workload reductions. And thinking on the heels of that, where, you know, again, following our normal model that we've experienced in the last few decades, is that in the recovery, then we have this huge bounce back where our classrooms are full, and you know, because on the heels of the recession recovery, the state doesn't have the money to fund us, right? And that's the sad paradigm that we're in. You know, I would say, you know, any model that recognizes and that responds to our cycles, that is somewhat unique and counter to the state's economy. Any model that really puts away funding for, you know, the rainy day, community college rainy day, that funds us when our demand and our need, in terms of being that economic engine for the state, any model that takes that into consideration would be a vast improvement over program-based funding, 361, or what we currently have. Specifically what those levers would be and what that would look like, I don't have that here today, but, you know, I would even venture, you know, this is being recorded, but I'd even venture to say that, you know, anyone at a state level or policy level that has been through at least the last maybe 20 years and recognizing that we're somewhat unique in that we're needed the most when the state has the least in terms of resources, perhaps putting away money that, you know, that probably any of us on here that has been through those cycles, you know, anything that would put away money to recognize that would be a great improvement of what we've had, in my view.
Thanks, Ron. Sarah, any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I would just reiterate that the problem has been from the get-go that we are underfunded by looking at that FTE measurement, right, as our model. And so I think it all sort of begins and ends there, is that if we had an appropriate level of funding per head count, right? If we had an appropriate level of funding per head count, that if there was a realistic understanding, right, from our legislature, right, about, you know, How many students need counseling? I mean, even think about how many of our of our processes are based on FTE. Like our fawn is based on FTE, right? And but now that the SCFF model has changed, does that mean we should reevaluate how we calculate the fawn, right? Are we going to need more counselors because now we have to have, more successes and more, financial aid applications filled out? So are you going to increase the fawn so that we can get the personnel we need to meet all of those metrics? So I think if we were going to look at a better way to fund the community colleges, it would really be attacking that FTE measurement.
Thanks, Sarah. And Andrew, do you have any thoughts on this?
I was just going to follow up and say, just because you're a part-time student doesn't mean you have part-time need. And that's the fundamental misunderstanding that so many make about our system, about the diversity I've mentioned before. The first word that comes to your mind, not diversity in the sense of race or ethnicity, but in age and in income. And that is the truth that our system lives with, and it's not being recognized. And I'll also just second Ron's comment about, the state needs us the most when it has the least. We're the engine of economic recovery, and if we run out of fuel, and we stall and we seize, everyone else is worse for the wear because of it. So I just want to highlight that.
Thanks, Andrew. So thank you all for being here. Ron, Ron, when you attend a FACC event, you become a friend of the faculty. So don't worry about that overhead comment earlier. You're good now.
Thanks, Evan. I'll call my EAP program later tonight.
I had to say something. Sarah, thank you so much for being here. Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time. Can we please get a round of applause for our excellent panel? Great. So we are going to be moving on to our next session. So we have 3 concurrent sessions coming up here. And the same situation as last time. You'll have an opportunity to jump to those breakout rooms. You should see them open now. So you'll see the 4 small squares below that say breakout sessions. Staff will remain here. If you have any challenges, we can move you into the rooms you need to be at. Please keep in mind those sessions will conclude around 3:50. So you'll have a little bit of a break before our final presentation at 4 o'clock, which will be back here. So make sure you go to the sessions and then come back here by 4 o'clock for our final session. And then that'll be the end of the day after that session. So this is the last time you'll hear from me. And then tomorrow we want to make sure you are back to here at 10 a.m. So please jump into your session and have a great rest of your day. We'll see you at 4 o'clock, and then we'll see you tomorrow morning at 10.
Just want to say thank you so much to FACC for having the student here, and I just appreciate it. And we look forward to partnering on future events as well.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, it's been so great partnering with you all. I'm going to talk a little bit about more tomorrow and highlight our partnership tomorrow in the morning, but thanks so much for being here.